Shio Qwo-Li Dabado, Yali Sing God, Ani Alo Lanape Hoking, Ani Lanape Yet, Yali Si Nigad, Yomi, Ahnihi Shunale. Hello everyone, I'm Qwo-Li Driskill, and I want to thank the Lenape Nation whose lands we're on today, Lenape Hoking. And thank you all for coming this morning. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Oregon State University. So what I'm going to do is just introduce all of our fabulous panelists. We're going to go in order of the program. Scott Morgensen is associate professor in the Department of Gender Studies at Queen's University. He is the author of Spaces Between Us, Queer Settler Colonialism and Indigenous Decolonization. He is the co-editor of Queer Indigenous Studies, Critical Interventions in Theory, Politics, and Literature, and of Karangatia, Calling Out Gender and Sexuality in Settler Societies, a special issue of Settler Colonial Studies. Our next speaker will be Cameron Greensmith. Cameron is a PhD candidate in Humanities, Social Sciences, and Social Justice Education at the University of Toronto. Cameron has forthcoming publication in the American Indian Culture and Research Journal titled Challenging Settler Colonialism in Contemporary Queer Politics, Settler Homonationalism by Toronto and Two-Spirit Subjectivities. He is also published in the Journal of Homosexuality and the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies. Cameron is currently working on his dissertation, which seeks to uncover the potential racism and settler colonialism within queer social service organizations in Toronto by addressing how queer social service workers come to perceive Indigenous people through their work and through dominant cultural representations. After that, we will hear from Cierra Webster. Cierra is a MA candidate in the Department of Visual Arts at Western University. Her thesis examines homonationalism through 3 different contemporary art practices. She also teaches art theory and has provided guest lectures on early 20th century art and art advertising. Her work has been published in museums, marginality, and the mainstream. In 2013, Cierra was the co-organizer of the International Graduate Student Conference, Reactivating Objects, Social Theory, and Material Culture. She is also the co-editor of a forthcoming publication of the same title. Michael Connors Jackman can't be here today, but he is one of the co-authors of one of the papers. And Michael is finishing up his PhD at the Department of Anthropology, York University. Nishant Upadhyay is a doctoral candidate at the Department of Social and Political Thought at York University. And Jean-Thomas Tremblay is a graduate student in English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University. His current research articulates itself along 2 axes. The first project, an assemblage of new materialism, affect theory, and queer theory, focuses on the proximities prompted by bodily isolation in order to understand queer becomings outside of identitarian frames. And the second project inquires into the interaction between space and productivity to trace the affective circuits of toxicity, which determine the level of life of different clusters of matter. So, these are our fabulous folks today, and I'll stop talking and let them talk.
Thanks so much, Qwo-Li. And I'm Scott Morgensen, and I'm so thankful for the opportunity to be here today and to be on this really exciting panel. It's really fun to meet people I hadn't met before. Actually, still about to meet some people that I haven't met before, and folks that I've known. Our work has overlapped in various ways in Canada, both because of where we're located and also, maybe even more importantly, because of the issues that we address. And it's, I'm really looking forward to the potential synergy among our talks. I'm also really thankful for this conference's existence. I just want to thank all of the conference organizers, in particular Sarah Stolden and Matt Brin, with whom I communicated over the last few months, Really excited by the energy here, the positive energy to bring together both a very specific form of critique and localized and regional organizing around Palestine and Israel and the Middle East with the broad applicability of the categories homonationalism and pinkwashing, which continue in these really interesting ways I've been noticing through the panels yesterday and today, seem to simultaneously have this powerful resonance with both the specificity and a kind of comparison. And that's certainly the kind of way that I think about the terms right now, and you'll see that it's reflected in some of the things that I have to share today. And I also just want to specifically thank Honey Mikey for her leadership, her historical leadership in El Caos, and for her really powerful keynote address yesterday. And when I heard her speaking about the need, I won't be able to remember the specific way that she addressed it, but when she talked about the way in which queer solidarity with queer Palestinians internationally would need to shift at some point from thinking that it is supporting queer Palestinians to understanding that it is actually responsible to the Palestinian people and the Palestinian nation and Palestinian decolonization. That was a very powerful message for me to hear. It is a message that I've heard from queer Palestinian activists for many years, that we've heard from queer Palestinian activists for many years. But it also specifically reminded me yesterday of the message that I have received from Indigenous feminist, queer, trans, and two-spirit activists here in this territory, in this land. And the work that actually challenged me and inspired me to reconceptualize my critical work as that of a white settler critic of white supremacist settler colonization on these territories, and from that location to try to build my potential alliances and solidarities internationally. So you'll see that that's the way in which I'm framing my work in this paper as well. I'm reading a little bit from a paper that I've been giving the last few months, and that was also just recently invited to be published on Jadaliya. It's been up for about a week. So I'm just reading a portion of that paper, and so if you've read it, if you've seen it there already, or you could go back and look at it to, just to check in about the content that I'm sharing with you right now. So thanks. And the title is, different from in the program, Settler Colonialism and Alliance, Comparative Critiques of Pinkwashing and Homonationalism. Critics of Israeli pinkwashing in the United States and Canada have increasingly engaged in comparative critiques of settler colonialism. Queers Against Israeli Apartheid in Toronto has invoked this critique for many years. Pinkwashers across Canada also draw ties between Palestinian and Indigenous solidarity that are heightened by the recent emergence in Canada of the Indigenous peoples movement Idle No More. Today, scholars and activists ask how homonationalism and pinkwashing perform settler colonialism in Palestine, Canada, and the United States, and how settler colonialism in each state impacts their activism. I write this piece to encourage such questions and to invite questioners to address our relationship to Indigenous solidarity. As a white queer critic of United States and Canadian settler colonialism, my experience with Indigenous solidarity in these states informs how I engage Palestinian solidarity. Queer trans Indigenous critiques and allied work by non-natives already model a critique of settler colonialism and sexualization in Canada and in the United States. Their potential synergy with critiques of Israeli pinkwashing can explain the forms of power that we face and can expand and deepen our alliances. Now, when queer Palestinians challenge Israeli claims to sexual modernity and international solidarity with Israel, they demand the decolonization of Palestine and the refocusing of queer trans solidarity on that goal. Prior to the international circulation of this critique, queer trans politics in Europe, North America, and the Pacific already confronted a variety of anti-colonial critiques, and those continue because their struggles remain. But in Canada and the United States, a specific critique of settler colonialism often remained absent, despite Two-Spirit and queer and trans Indigenous activists having demanded one for over 40 years. Today, the critique of settler colonialism may be more familiar to queer, trans, non-natives in these states, but it still can be ignored, or if it is acknowledged, it might appear without any evident relationship to landed Indigenous decolonization struggles. For these reasons, Indigenous critics of queer trans settler colonialism in the Americas and Pacific and their allies have been invigorated by queer Palestinian and allied critiques of similar power relations in Palestine and by the potential synergy of their work. Palestinians who critically theorize settler colonialism while engaging in indigenous solidarity also have inspired alliances. For instance, the co-editors of the recent spring 2012 issue of Settler Colonial Studies called for the interrogation, which is called Past is Present Settler Colonialism in Palestine, called for the interrogation of Israel as a settler colonial state by comparing it to European settler projects worldwide. They apply new theories of settler colonialism, such as Patrick Wolf's claim that agents of settler colonialism mean not only to occupy or to subjugate, but also to eliminate settler colonialism's targets by replacing them with newly indigenized settlers. In the same issue, Waziatouine suggests that even if Palestinians and Native Americans affirm their shared indigenous identity, it is their structural locations under settler colonial rule that ground their potential comparison and alliance. Mike Krebs and Dana Ulwin recently examined how Palestinians in Canada engage with Indigenous activists by comparatively theorizing their experiences of settler colonialism and their work for decolonization. Such intentions also informed the December 2012 statement of Palestinian solidarity with Idle No More, which was launched in Vancouver by Khaled Barakat of Samidoun, Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network. The statement argues that based on the, quote, deep connections and similarities between the experiences of our peoples and on Prime Minister Stephen Harper's support for Israeli apartheid, struggles against colonialism in Canada and Palestine must interlink. So potential alliances of Indigenous peoples of the Americas and the Pacific and Palestinians also inform critiques of homonationalism and pinkwashing. For generations, queer trans non-natives in Canada and the United States have been called upon to challenge colonialism by Two-Spirit and queer trans Indigenous activists, from gay American Indians in 1975 to Qwo-Li and Barchiampe in 1992 to the Native Youth Sexual Health Network today. While nurturing Two-Spirit resurgence, they created formidable theories of sexualization and colonial power. Indigenous and allied writers in such texts as Sexuality, Nationality, Indigeneity from 2010 and Queer Indigenous Studies from 2011, well, personal shout out there, but also collective, answered this legacy and directed queer trans theories and politics to engage Indigenous decolonization. These texts appeared just as the international profile of pinkwashing was increasing, and their potential connections have informed ongoing discussions among activists and scholars. For instance, how is homonationalism conditioned by settler colonialism? And how do varied forms of pinkwashing obscure settler rule in Israel, Canada, and the United States? In each of these states, are homonationalism and pinkwashing specifically settler colonial phenomena that perform distinctly settler colonial work? Now, inspired by solidarity, these comparisons also invoke the power that inflects alliance. Increasingly, scholars and activists understand the critiques of Israel launched from the US or Canada risk reinforcing settler colonialism on these lands unless they address the coloniality of each state. Writing as a non-Jew who is responsible for challenging anti-Semitism, I address this concern first to all of us who are positioned in the United States or Canada as white settlers, non-Jewish, and Jewish. Across our differences, which are very important to address, we can ask when and how we inherit the representative authority of a white settler state. Such states use multiculturalism to fold racialized people into a settler nation, a process that's been challenged by Harsha Walia, Binash Jaffrey, Shaista Patel, many scholars, and we'll be thinking about their work today as well, who address how racialized people become linked to settler colonialism and must become responsible to Indigenous decolonization on these lands. Yet white supremacy positions racialized non-natives distinctly from white settlers who need to interrogate our divergent relationships to white supremacy and settlement as Jews or non-Jews who nevertheless remain linked to settler whiteness. White pinkwashers in the United States and Canada can ask how racial investments in settlement might inflect our work for Palestinian solidarity. If white people critique Israel but do not recognize Israel to be settler colonial, Does this reflect our desire to naturalize settler colonialism at home? If we do critique Israel as a settler state, which actually is becoming increasingly apparent in a lot of the conversations, but we do not link that critique back to where we live, does this mean that we fear unsettling the grounds that helped form and launch our critique? And if we urgently challenge Israel's settler colonization of Palestine, urgently challenge it, but on the premise that it might yet be undone, do we imply that settler colonialism in the Americas and Pacific is permanent and insurmountable, which is a normative settler story that can absolve one of needing to act to end it? I ask these questions to link our self-reflections to a question that Palestinians and other racialized non-natives in the US and Canada have also asked already. How can activists in these states work for Palestinian decolonization while being responsible to the decolonial struggles of Indigenous peoples on whose lands this work takes place? Idle No More has raised the stakes for solidarity against settler colonialism as Indigenous peoples in North America once again place settler sovereignty in question. I'm running out of time, so I'll just briefly say that 4 months ago, in response to Canadian Bill C-45, threatening to expropriate traditional lands, 4 Saskatchewan women activists tweeted #IdleNoMore and energized Indigenous people in the grassroots movement to restore Indigenous governance. And I'm sure you're aware of this, and I hope that you'll check out stuff online, and I list some of what you might check out in my essay. So I'll talk more about Idle No More if you have questions. To conclude, as we continue gathering to address pinkwashing and homonationalism, we can answer current struggles with the inspiration of activist histories. In 1990, New York City's Qwo-Li and Barchiampe co-founded this city's first queer trans of color coalition called the Kairos Collective, which was the progenitor of the Audre Lorde Project, as many of you know. And Two-Spirit activists led the Kairos Collective in protesting the 1992 Columbus Quincentennial and in jointly critiquing racism and settler colonialism. Their work, over 20 years ago, their work displaced queer exceptionalism by centering the critique of white supremacist settler colonization in linked struggles. Critics of pinkwashing and homonationalism today also can confront white supremacist settler colonialism as a set of landed, affective, and relational practices that inform how we think and how we live. Those practices can be challenged by returning to the fraught space of alliance, and they're struggling to link our movements. Thank you so much.
So hello and welcome. I changed my title ever so slightly. It's called Building Queer Alliances Between Indigenous and Diasporic People of Color, Critiques of Citizenship. So the paper that I share with you all today is evolved in my comprehensive exams and discusses the politics of alliances when Indigenous decolonization is centralized within queer theorizing and activism. After all, for me, social change cannot occur without us being able to think and imagine the world differently. This politics of alliances emerges out of my divergent standpoints as a psychiatrized, white, cisgendered queer settler and what is now known as Canada. Within my scholarship and activism, I aim to decenter whiteness and settlerhood by holding myself accountable to Indigenous peoples and to diasporic people of color. This paper centralizes the key debates happening within Indigenous settler solidarity circles by highlighting the tensions within a politics of alliances. Moreover, this paper centralizes Indigenous feminist, queer, and Two-Spirit scholarship through the dismantling of the nation state and the normalization of the white queer settler subject. I hope to show how Indigenous scholars have engaged and continue to engage in alliances and relationship building with other racialized and colonized peoples. In their groundbreaking essay, Lawrence and Dua call upon anti-racist and post-colonial scholars to meaningfully address indigeneity within their activism and scholarship. They maintain that in doing so, scholars must take Indigenous decolonization seriously. Moreover, their most contentious argument, fraught with much controversy, asks non-Indigenous peoples to think about their own complicity in ongoing reproduction of settler colonialism. Sharman Wright respond to Lawrence and Dua, and I actually learned that Lawrence and Dua respond to Sharman Wright, but I haven't read that piece just yet. By further critiquing indigeneity and within anti-racist and post-colonial scholarship, arguing that Indigenous peoples end up promoting and perpetuating neo-racism. However, Sharma and Wright fail to address how non-Indigenous peoples benefit from and are complicit in settler colonialism. Instead, Sharma and Wright argue that by centralizing the very real experiences of conquest and settler colonialism, ignores and prevents joint resistance against colonialism. As opposed to Lawrence and Dewar's focus on centering Indigenous decolonization in local contexts, Sharma and Wright are calling for collective action from colonialism on a transnational scale. But Andrea Smith argues that women of color and Indigenous women experience the effects of racism and colonialism differently. Thus, Sharma and Wright their call for collective action homogenizes the divergent histories and contemporary experiences of racism and settler colonialism. In calling for a politics of alliances, I evoke diasporic feminists of color, such as Banish Jafari and Shasta Patel, who are engaging in alliances with Indigenous peoples and in a dialogue surrounding settlers of color, complicity in settler colonialism. Jafari and Patel provide an avenue for decolonization that does not reproduce what Andrea Smith calls an oppression Olympics. And in doing so, conversations can occur whereby non-Indigenous queers can engage in critical conversations with one another that do not end in a critique. The scholarship of diasporic queers of color must be engaged with, since they provide an avenue through which to problematize, trouble, and ultimately challenge larger systems and structures that benefit white settler queerness. Qwo-Li argues that queer scholars must situate their theorizing within constructions of the nation-state and ask them to acknowledge that some nations are productive of non-normative sexualities, not merely repressive of them. Here, Qwo-Li contextualizes the making of a proper queer, and here it's the white, gay, male subject, through the nation by evoking homonationalism. And I'm not going to actually go through homonationalism because I assume that all of you are very familiar with that. So in theorizing kind of desire as it's connected to gender and sexuality, we can see how desire can connect to nationalism, migration, slavery, citizenship, and immigration. So Andrea Smith utilizes Munoz's theory of disidentification within an Indigenous context. Disidentification is helpful because it provides a theoretical apparatus that can allow colonized people to engage in multiple strategies in order to build a sufficient base to support that can dismantle the settler state. Disidentification is a descriptive of the survival strategies that minority subjects practice in order to negotiate a phobic majoritization public sphere that continually elides or punishes the existence of subjects who did not conform to the phantasm of normative citizenship, and that's Munoz. The process of disidentification is meant to push beyond constraints placed onto racialized and colonized subjectivities by recycling identities and making them new again. Although Smith finds disidentification useful for Indigenous decolonization, Qwo-Li Driskill, who's right beside me, and Andrea Smith, in another piece, criticized disidentification as not addressing the logics of settler colonialism. Disidentification produces minority subjectivities, which collide oppressive politics and erase divergent histories of racism and colonialism. Indigenous peoples are not invested in trying to carve out a minority space within the settler state. Instead, Indigenous peoples assert Indigenous decolonization to radically dismantle the settler state. And here's the kind of distinction. Queer diasporic scholars of color are also theorizing diaspora. As a theoretical stance, diasporic subjectivity does not exist solely within the border or of either a home or a nation. In the context of the South Asian diaspora, Gayatri Gopinath criticizes canonical and diasporic literatures as heteronormative and erasing complexities of race and migration as producing queer desires, often female and subjectivities. Gopinath pushes beyond centering Western modernity within queer theorizing and argues that heteronormativity is coupled within the logic of British colonialism and Indian nationalism. Gopinath argues that a queer diasporic critique recuperates the desires, practices, and subjectivities that are rendered impossible and unimaginable within conventional diasporic and national imaginaries. A queer diasporic critique engages with the production of modern sexual subjects that continue to render racialized and gendered queerness impossible. From Smith's standpoint, engagements with a queer diasporic critique typically reinscribe Indigenous peoples and nations as straight, effectively erasing Indigenous gender and erotic diversity. Smith pushes Gopinath's analysis in order to engage and highlight queer diasporic complicity in reifying the genocide and violence imposed onto Indigenous peoples. Smith maintains that queer diasporic peoples require Indigenous peoples as illusionary in order to continue their complicity in settler colonialism. And engaging with Gopinath, Driskill engages with a two-spirit critique, which questions how radical queer politics would replicate colonial taxonomies, realities, even as they attempt to disrupt. Driskill argues that a two-spirit critique engages with queer studies' responsibility to examine the ongoing colonialism, genocide, survival, and resistance of Native nations and peoples. Importantly, Driskill calls upon queer scholars to take Indigenous decolonization seriously, to include indigeneity within theorizing, to address settler colonialism as it's imbricated with queerness, and to engage in ongoing relationships with Indigenous peoples. So here I use Driskill and Smith's work to kind of show how they build upon queer diasporic peoples' colors critiques in order to provide critical insights into ways in which modern modalities of white queerness underscore divergent subjectivities of diasporic, colonized, and racialized queers. The scholarship posed by queer, feminist, and two-spirit Indigenous peoples is both critical of the oppressive nature of queer diasporic peoples of colors scholarship and simultaneously engages with the theoretical insights as it dismantles white supremacy and settler colonialism by foregrounding Indigenous decolonization. So I'm just going to wrap up. So taking direction from Javari and Patel, this paper argues that scholars and activists who are invested in queerness must center Indigenous decolonization. Here, positioning myself as a white settler, I conclude by connecting the above debates to white allyship with Indigenous peoples and to diasporic peoples of color. White scholars and activists must engage in the politics of alliances by dismantling white supremacy, starting there. Thus, in order to decolonize, white settlers must engage in relationships with Indigenous peoples, with the land, through a historical and contemporary analysis. Failing to do so evokes settler amnesia. Alliance building recognizes that non-Indigenous peoples are in a relationship with Indigenous peoples. After all, we're all treaty people, using the late Roger Simon, sorry. Thus, Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples alike are responsible for reparations against the continual violence of colonialism. No longer should this be the responsibility of only Indigenous folks. Responsibility is evoked when within alliances by recognizing the residues of queerness seeped within the settler colonial logic. White queer scholars must engage with how their theorizing typically reifies and naturalizes the settler state, effectively erasing Indigenous peoples in that process. In taking Indigenous decolonization seriously, white queer scholars can engage with their own complicity in settler colonialism and move beyond simple articulations of who is and who is not a settler. So it's kind of the identity politics argument, kind of throwing that out the window and actually talking about where we are and how we can theorize from where we are. Instead, I want to say that again. Instead, by asking who benefits from and who is complicit in settler colonialism, we can centralize indigeneity, whereby white settlers have to ask whose traditional land are we on. I conclude by urging white scholars to start to implicate modern sexuality as a form of conquest enacted on stolen lands. It is my hope that white queer scholars and activists can begin to engage in the messy, often controversial conversations where Indigenous decolonization and dismantling of the settler state is put at the forefront. Calling for queer alliances does not preclude conversation. Instead, it invites dialogue through a centering of Indigenous decolonization that does not homogenize the vast experiences of white supremacy, settler colonialism, homonormativity, and heteropatriarchy. An emancipatory queer future must engage with Indigenous erasure within modern queer theorizing and activism, and foreground Indigenous decolonization to centralize relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Thank you.
little, so you can't see very much, but check out that thing. So, hello, I'm Cierra. I want to once again thank the organizers for this super rad conference. Sarah Schulman and everyone, I am honored and stoked to be a part of the people who are here in this dialogue, so thank you. I also wanted to preface that this is part of a much larger paper. It's only 12 minutes, although it may go a little bit long. And so feel free to ask questions, or I would welcome any critique or discussion, because this is what I look at. So my paper is called Queering Settler Colonialism through Miss Chief Eagle Testicle. And probably when you guys read that, you were like, who's Miss Chief Eagle Testicle? Well, that sassy person is Miss Chief Eagle Testicle. This is a film still from Kent Muckman's Group of 7 Inches film from 2005, which is not what I'm really looking at, but I just really like that scene with like her riding up in this, repurposing this imagery of encounter. So before I start, this is the interactive component of my presentation. Who is, by a show of nods and shakes, who's familiar with the work of Kent Muckman? Excellent, so a couple of you. So for those of you who know, you'll know what I'm talking about. For those of you who don't, I get to corrupt you with my own perspective, so welcome. Oh, and that's the end of the interactive component. Okay, so Kent Muckman is a Canadian contemporary artist of Cree ancestry who interrogates the ways in which First Nations peoples have been presented in historical North American 19th and 20th century artworks. Much of his work utilizes queer imagery to critique the way that sexuality and Christianity have been dependent on colonialism. Muckman comes from a Christian background, and so he is more interested in the Christianity side of things, and there's a lot you could say about that, but we're gonna leave that aside for now and just look at his queer critique. And how I read in his strategies of queer and settler colonialism. Specifically analyzing his painting series from 2010-2011 and his incorporation of Two-Spirit imagery in these works, I argue that Muckman mutually imbricates queer studies and settler colonialism to expose how settler heterocolonialism and homonationalism operate. And this is the part where I'm explaining my project, where I would usually define what settler heterocolonialism and homonationalism means, but you all know anyway, so we're good. So through his inclusion of Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, who is Muckman's flamboyant high-heeled alter ego, who's right there, Muckman deconstructs and unsettles stereotypes and mythologies found within dominant art cultures. By foregrounding queer First Nations subjects in his paintings, Muckman's work considers how histories of Canadianness have been created, mythologized, and publicly circulated through memorializing devices such as exhibitions and artworks. Muckman's queer critique of Canadian colonialism calls on non-First Nations museum goers, and I think this is significant, to recognize how nationhood, gender, and sexuality are interwoven and privileged for them as settlers. And significantly, Kent Muckman's paintings, I argue, shift the focus of art theory and queer studies to include a consciousness of its ongoing colonial reality. So, to start, I'm going to show you some of the artworks that I'm talking about. Kent Muckman is an interdisciplinary artist. He does a whole bunch of things, and he does many, many paintings, so I'm kind of just choosing a couple, but you can go on his website and check out the rest of his oeuvre. And I'm also not going to give you an iconographic description of every single one. I'm instead just going to give you an overview, and hopefully they can be in the background. You guys can be thinking about what I'm talking about as they're up. And okay, so this is Sunday in the Park and Kiss the Sky, both from 2010. Oh, sorry, there's Kent Muckman with Kiss the Sky from 2010. This is Empathy for the Less Fortunate and Descend into Amnesia, 2011. Something to keep in mind as well are the titles. So as Cameron just said, like the colonial amnesia that happens, Descend into Amnesia, I think it's fine with that. There's Two-Spirit and East versus West, both from 2011 as well. And this is Wolf's Haircut and Montcalm's Haircut, both from 2011. So, I'm not going to spend much time explaining settler colonialism as opposed to colonialism, which is something that I usually have to do when I explain my project. But something that I do want everyone to keep in mind is that at Cuny Scott, settler colonialism necessitates that First Nations people are scripted as dispensable, or in the case of First Nations people in Canada, as an unwelcome outsider, or as the other, as we all know. And these sets of concepts and narratives of history are reinscribed and constructed through art practices. So now we're going to move into our Canadian art history section. And so Paul Kane is one of the main artists whose work Muckman appropriates and critiques. This is his Indian encampment on Lake Huron and the Surveyor, both from 1850. And he's a particularly really famous Canadian historical artist, and especially for his depictions of First Nations peoples. And I just want to show you as well some contemporaries of Paul Kane's, Thomas Coles and Lucius O'Brien from late 1800s. And so my intention in showing you other artists than just Paul Kane is to make evident the way that these artistic tropes were extremely widespread. It is and was not only one artist who is creating these mythologies of romanticized Canadiana, but instead a vast proliferation of artists who were working in these themes and these styles in the 19th and 20th century. And as one art critic addresses, quote, Muckman knows the canon well enough to be able to read between, around, and through the narratives that we have come to accept as our heritage, whatever that means. Anyway, the stereotypes, the racism, and violence, and the power struggles that the New World was founded upon, and that are perpetuated to this day, are of course fertile ground for contemporary artists of Cree ancestry, end quote. So, Muckman takes these historical representations of Canadianness, meticulously reproduces them. I mean meticulously reproduces them. These slides do not even remotely do towards justice. They're huge and really, really, really sexy in the way that everyone likes a good landscape. So he meticulously reproduces them and then adds mischief eagle testicle. And Muckman stated that, quote, the whole body of work is about revisiting these early images that represent the very safe and secure foundation of mythology and exploration of the West. When you look at these paintings as an Aboriginal person, you recognize how subjective they are. So I realized. So when I make these paintings, I'm not necessarily repainting history, but I'm nudging people towards seeing that there are these big missing narratives, end quote. So in other words, Muckman's work appropriate common narratives of interactions between colonizers and First Nations people and unravel the absurdity of many of these mythologies. So by queering settler colonialism, I mean that Muckman is including mischief eagle testicle and turning these extremely common and pervasive narratives on their head. And additionally and significantly, you can't see very well. So Miss Chief is here. She's painting all of the flamboyant people lounging on the ground. And so one of the things significantly is that Miss Chief is the artist in these. So she takes on the role of the European depictor. That has to do with her name, which we can talk about later if you'd like. And also because she holds this, this ambiguous, fluid gender sexuality position, she disrupts that binary logics of colonialism and disrupts those logics and workings, which is what I think is significant. And so all of this, in turn, as I pointed out before, demands that the museum goer, the viewer, examines their position in this discussion. And lastly, Muckman purports that his practice is about reclaiming these spaces. So what I'm doing, he says, quote, is taking the most spectacular landscapes that I can find and painstakingly reproducing them in a way that conceptually reclaims those spaces, end quote. So by queering settler colonialism, I mean, as you all probably know, I'm an art historian, so this is where this comes from, but museums, cultural institutions, and dominant art culture frequently create, reinscribe, and uphold societal values. And particularly the societal values that I'm arguing they uphold are settler heteronormativity, settler heterocolonialism, and homonationalism. So I argue that Kent Muckman's paintings elucidate and critique settler heterocolonialism and homonationalism in two ways. So first, Muckman's reversal of the exoticism and othering of museological and aesthetic techniques works to highlight the absurdity of many of these historical documentations of First Nations peoples and their interactions. So for instance, Paul Catlin is one of the major artists that Muckman critiques. And so when you have this representation, and side note, Muckman became interested in Two-Spirit identities when he found out that Paul Catlin knew of Two-Spirit peoples and chose not to depict them in his artworks. And so Paul Catlin is a really big figure here. So anyway, Kent Muckman reverses or kind of just elucidates the way in which these sort of depictions are ridiculous. And by queering this reversal, through his addition of mischief eagle testicle, Muckman's work points to heterocolonialist logics on which our contemporary society is predicated. and elucidates the ways in which binary understandings of gender and sexuality are dependent on and crucial to colonialism. So, mischief, love her. Muckman's mobilization of two-spirit critique can be seen as a criticism of and source of resistance to colonialism and homonationalism in what is now known as Canada. By focusing on mischief, this two-spirit character, Muckman moves the discussion away from the white male European's gaze, as I mentioned before. And instead of including two spirits of the margins, which is what critiques, theories, and politics have done, according to scholars such as Driskill, Muckman metaphorically and literally centers the discussion around mischief. Through an analysis of Muckman's work, I propose that heteropatriarchy is part of the colonial project, homonormativity is part of the nationalist project, and two-spirit critiques challenge that erasure of First Nations peoples. So through the work of Muckman, I maintain that only with the denaturalization of colonialism can queer movements proceed inclusively. Following periods of scholars who either call for the centering of queerness in Indigenous studies or the centering of decolonization in queer studies, I maintain that Muckman's work is an effective and poignant place in which we can see these movements and theories coming together. So, to conclude, by elucidating the mythologized history of queer First Nations settler attractions, so for instance, why isn't this what happened? Why didn't Miss Chief, with her awesome shoes, in a Mary Magdalene-esque style, wash the feet of a man that looks very much like Prince William? Why isn't that what happened? By elucidating the mythologized history of queer First Nations settler attractions, along with an examination of how those understandings are based in heteropatriarchy and contemporarily homonationalism as well, I think that Muckman's work opens up potential space for denaturalization and hopefully decolonization. Thank you.
It's okay, I'll sit here and talk. It's more comfortable than standing. I want to begin with, again, thanking the organizers of the conference for providing the space for all of us to in our space that might be very isolating work, come together and have critical conversations. I'm also super excited to be on the same desk as Qwo-Li and Scott, whose work continuously guides my work and challenges my work. My co-presenter and co-author, Michael, cannot be here, and he's asked me to convey his regrets to family emergencies. He was not able to come to New York. I also want to begin with acknowledging the Indigenous lands that we are on currently, which remain occupied and stolen, and the lands that I come from, Toronto, which are traditional territories of Mississaugas of New Credit and Anishinaabe people. This is not just a symbolic gesture, but a reminder for myself and for everyone here in the audience that how that these lands and the presence of non-native people on these lands contradicts, challenges, unsettles, and guides my work throughout within the academy, outside the academy, and also as my daily lived experiences as a very racialized body on these lands. Right? How, as a racialized body, I'm still complicit in these processes, the ongoing processes of settler colonialism. With that, I'm going to mostly read my paper, and if I'm rushing too fast, please feel free to stop me and try to pace myself down. Okay. So over the last few years, many scholars and activists in what is often known as Canada and the United States have raised questions around how critics of Israeli pinkwashing and occupation of Palestine wherein challenge, engage, negotiate, perform, or reproduce settler colonialism on indigenous lands of Turtle Island. We, me and Michael, are interested in building on this body of critique and scholarship by specifically analyzing queer politics in Toronto, by examining debates over the participation of queers against Israeli apartheid, Qwo-Li, in Pride Toronto 2010, and the subsequent formation of Pride Coalition for Free Speech, PCFS. We seek to critically explore how certain queer practices reproduce settler colonialism in the Canadian context, and in fact work to pinkwash Canada as a queer-friendly liberal state. While our discussion focuses on Qwo-Li, PCFS, and Pride 2010, the objective of our presentation is not to single out or lay individual blame, but we are interested in contributing to conversations about the larger politics at stake within radical queer organizing, whatever that means. These examples serve as the entry point for us to think through critically how the articulation of this radical queer perspective are complicit in white settler state project, specifically by casting Canada as a gay-friendly nation, and further invisibilizing past and ongoing processes of colonialism in Canada. To provide a little bit context for those of you who might not be familiar with Qwo-Li, Queers Against Israeli Apartheid. This is a activist group based out of Toronto, formed to work in solidarity with queers in Palestine and Palestine solidarity movements around the world against Israeli apartheid, and specifically Israeli use of gay rights, pinkwashing, colonial occupation of Palestine. Qwo-Li marched in Pride Toronto in 2008 and 2009, despite various attempts by pro-Israeli organizations to censor their participation. Tensions reached a pinnacle in 2010 when Pride barred Qwo-Li from participating in Pride events by banning the term Israeli apartheid. A group of queer activists, Qwo-Li and non-Qwo-Li members, formed the Pride Coalition for Free Speech to redress the situation. The debate that ensued included a range of people with competing interests. We suggest that the framework of the debate did not emerge by accident, but arose out of particular queer activist histories. Put forward as a core political issue, censorship became central to the debates over Qwo-Li's participation in the Pride events. A very prominent intervention along those lines were launched by Extra, Toronto's main gay lesbian monthly. In a widely cited editorial, Extra insisted that anti-censorship struggles are fundamental to the history of queer activism. The overall discussion over Qwo-Li's participation was split between those who felt they ought to celebrate gay rights in Israel and those who opposed domestic forms of censorship proposed by Pride. Feelings of support and dissent were thus organized around the question of statehood and rights awarded by Canada and Israel, shaping effective responses to the banning of Qwo-Li through narratives of national progress. PCFS outlined the raison d'être of the group on its Facebook page in May 2010. We want to share 3 of the key 13 points that they provide on this page. First, we do not support Pride Toronto's decision to ban the use of terminology. Pride Toronto's recent action begs the question beyond Israel, beyond Palestine, and towards the larger question of censorship. Second, we call upon the Pride Toronto to remember its history and continue in its tradition, the diverse, inclusive festival it has been for the last 30 years. And lastly, Toronto is a city that can be a global model for solving conflict, where differences can be resolved on a foundation of free speech through use of dialogue, negotiation, and law if necessary, but not through censorship. These key messages group together central tensions that were only partly related to debates over freedom of expression. First, the issue of censorship versus is Palestine-Israel. Second, the casting of the history of Pride as one of inclusion. And third, the suggestion that Toronto can serve as a global model for conflict resolution. Posters and signage generated by PCFS had a unifying message of free speech that was ultimately tied to imagined history of Pride as a truly inclusive space. From the outset, PCFS outlined its position as supportive of Qwo-Li and free speech, but not necessarily in agreement with Qwo-Li's mandate. As PCFS came together in an effort to resent the ban, it did so by arguing on grounds of free speech, connecting the struggles of Qwo-Li to a long history of censorship battles fought by queers in Toronto. In doing so, the concern with the occupation of Palestine came to be separated from the domestic concerns of free speech and queer praxis within Pride Toronto. What we want to foreground are the complex connections between the quest for gay rights and the more multi-layered project of nation building. The question of where queer activism fits within processes of nation building is complex, as the rejection of Pride. Sitting here, I'll skip that time. The PCFS affair raises questions about the extent to which collective remembering reproduces configuration of national belonging in instances where activists explicitly oppose the normativizing processes of national building while simultaneously denying settler colonial past and present. Along with other scholars and activists, we question how settler queer politics is produced and maintained by settler colonialism. Queer settlers are complicit in reimagining and reproducing the same nation-building narratives that the state produces and maintains. By invoking such narratives, Morgenson argues queer make the settler state their horizon of freedom. Our discussion of PCFS is intended to analyze the liminal line where radical queer perspectives can easily engender Canada as a gay-friendly nation and further invisibilize past and ongoing processes of colonialism. Qwo-Li and Mikdashi have argued that pinkwashing reproduces pinkwashing by critiquing pinkwashing. Building on Qwo-Li and Mikdashi and Morgensen, we argue that pinkwashing is enabled by and enables the homonationalist white settler colonial state of Canada and makes colonization of Canada and Turtle Island and simultaneously for Palestine naturalized, inevitable, and invisibilized. Canada, after all, is a much bigger pinkwasher, internally and globally, as it successfully keeps its image peaceful, non-colonial, and queer-friendly. So we want to ask, why does pinkwashing happens in Palestine only? Quite simply, why is there no specifically queer solidarity with Turtle Island? Indigenous scholars and activists have continually challenged and questioned this invisibilization of past and ongoing processes of settler colonialism. As Lawrence writes, quote, Native history becomes accounts of specific intervals of contact, accounts which neutralize processes of genocide, which never mention racism, and which do not take as part of their purview the devastating and ongoing implications of policies and processes that are so neatly described. In short, Morton Robinson writing within the context of white settler state of Australia notes, the colonials did not go home. Alfred, writing within the Canadian context, argues that imperial arrogance and obscurantism play a key role in the organizing processes, and he criticizes settlers who organize against colonialism abroad for not admitting decolonization as a necessity in Canada. Hence, Indigenous scholars and activists, including Indigenous, queer, and Two-Spirit peoples, call non-Indigenous scholars and activists to center past and ongoing processes of settler colonization in their work, and further, for queer settler activists and scholars, this necessitates an analysis of how and where transnational can inform the local, and inversely, local can inform the transnational. Our critique is not to deny the work of many queer non-natives who have challenged the complicities and challenged the settler colonial state. What we are more curious about are the absences and silences of collective queer identified organizing around Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination in Canada. Why is it that there is no queers against Canadian settler colonialism or queers in solidarity with Idle No More? Why was it so easy to generate support for PCFS and to end the ban on choir marching in Toronto Pride events, but it has been so difficult to raise awareness about the connections between queer struggles and Indigenous ones? Alex Wilson, one of the main organizers of Idle No More, for instance, has voiced her frustration that many queer people who are usually involved in progressive politics have not asked about Idle No More. She's argued, quote, we are talking about human rights and sovereignty. I think that's a place where LGBTQ community can connect. This is a global issue that affects all of us, end of quote. We know through the works of Indigenous queer feminists and two-spirit activists and scholars how intimately and violently gender and sexuality are centered to colonial processes. So why do we not see organized queer solidarity? In response to Idle No More, Danny Galbraith, Expert assignment editor, wrote an editorial in January 2013 titled We Are All Related, calling for queer solidarity with Idle No More. By creating a hypothetical future where all queer rights are taken away from the community, Glenwright argues, quote, it seems hard to believe, and thankfully it will never happen, at least not to the gay community. Yet, similar insidious and blatant attacks conspire for abortion people in the country and have for many years. End of quote. Showing solidarity to Idle No More, he further tells his reader that if history is any guide, they, the Indigenous people, have reasons to be scared. He acknowledges colonization of Indigenous peoples and their lands and resources, and how, he argues, has allowed the rest of us to enjoy a very nice life. Invoking Canadian multiculturalism, he further asks, how can we take pride in our many cultures when one group, Canada's First People, continue to be treated like second-class citizens? He concludes by saying that we are all related. While the doctrine may come from a place of good intentions, it very conveniently falls within the logics of queer settler colonialism. By using the language of rights, the editorial normalizes and naturalizes settler colonialism and makes the presence of settlers, as Morgensen would argue, inevitable and incontestable. It erases all differences in power between settler queers and Indigenous communities, as well as invisibilizes any presence of queer, Indigenous, and Two-Spirit peoples. Ironically, hence the attempt to admit settler colonial complicity reproduces settler colonialism. By claiming belonging and universal recognition from the state, such queer politics reinforce and re-legitimize the settler state, and the inevitable presence of settlers, queer or not, racialized or not, gender normative or not. Glenwright's article, along with examples of PCFS and Pride Toronto, demonstrate how queer political struggles can come to be divorced from Indigenous struggles, and despite good intentions, reproduce the settler colonial logics of the state. We conclude by joining the decolonial political demand to work towards a queer praxis that is transnational, and a transnational praxis that is queer, while being anti-colonial and decolonial both here and there. We conclude by arguing that queer praxis can only be queer when it is unsettling and decolonizing.
Okay. Hi everyone. Thanks for coming. So my paper is called Home is Where My Habits Have a Habitat, the affective fact or the temporality of homonationalism in Ottawa, Canada, but only the silly part of my title was retained for the program, but I'm not going to complain because it's funny. It like means nothing as it is. Okay, so it will mean something eventually. So in the summer of 2011, during which I spent a substantial amount of time establishing a personal and informal pedestrian cartography of New York City, I was frequently sidetracked as a recurrent question was directed at me. Do you have a minute for gay rights? Beyond the demagoguery that suffuses this formula, when it conflates equality with institutional inclusion, I found myself attending to the structure of my interlocutor's query. Do I have a minute for gay rights? In other words, what is the temporality of social recognition? Does a minute suffice, or alternatively, does one require a full minute for gay rights, 60 long seconds? So this investigation is propelled by desire to better understand the process through which homonationalism manifests itself as an affective assemblage that operates along the rhythms of neoliberalism. More precisely, I asked, what is the temporality by which an attachment to the nation-state arises as legitimate or reasonable within queer spaces? In attending to this question, I turned to Brian Musumi's concept of the affective fact, which I chart by means of a dissection of the Village Initiative in Ottawa, Canada. In November 2011, 6 signs denoting the delimitations of a GLBT-friendly village were installed along Ottawa's Bank Street. The event marked the culmination of a 6-year crusade led by the Village Initiative, a Centertown-based organization. According to its website, Le/The Village, which is the bilingual designation of the district as per the signs, quote, provides a safe space for a community to work, live, and play, celebrates our history, culture, and diversity, and is a burgeoning tourist destination, end quote. So the narration of the Village Initiative's campaign is primarily orchestrated by the gay monthly and lesbian newspaper Capital Extra, which is the Ottawa satellite of the Toronto-based not-for-profit media conglomerate Pink Triangle Press. So the organization is the contemporary iteration of the Body Politic, which was published between 1971 and 1987. And since 1998, Pink Triangle Press has been compensating for the scarcity of viable sources of revenue or income in print media by operating the gay hookup website squirt.org. The discourse put forward by former Village Initiative Chair Glenn Crawford was generally unquestioned by Capital Extra. On the other hand, most other parties involved, including City Councillors Diane Holmes and Jerry Lepage, who was the Executive Director of the Bank Street Business Improvement Area, or BIA, were simplistically ascribed antagonistic yearnings. That is, until they experienced the catharsis that prompted their change of heart in favor of the pro-village campaign. Contemplating the fulfillment of his mission, Crawford abdicated his position as chair of the Village Initiative in the winter of 2012. Crawford's messiah-like posture, explicit in his decision to step down after the achievement of a prophecy, is not the sole notion based on which the progression of the Village Initiative can be grasped in mystical or mythological terms. Crawford's mobilization of symbols such as the Wiedemann mural, an appeal to the timeless character of myths, has positioned his endeavor within a larger, dehistoricized struggle for the rights of sexual minorities. So Crawford unveiled a Wiedemann commemorative mural, which you can see on the slides, on August 26, 2011. The piece-based homage to the 1971 civil gay rights protests simultaneously held in Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver, which are coincidentally locations that are also Extra's current nuclei. Extra is the publisher that I discussed earlier. Wiedemann is an action brief presented at the protest, published in the first issue of the Body Politic and considered foundational by many. It laid the series of demands to end discrimination against homosexuals. Now, the vocation of the Village Initiative concretely translates into 5 decrees. First, shaping a tourist destination. Second, protecting current businesses and organizations while encouraging economic growth through a series of incentives for additional businesses and services to open in the area. Third, tackling, quote, rainbow embellishment and beautification projects, end quote, employing notably street signs and rainbow flags. Fourth, creating a space whose safety is defined by LGBT people's ability to, quote, work, live, and play, end quote, in the area. And fifth, stressing the contribution made by GLBT population who is territorially assigned to this enclave to the general Ottawa community. Now, there's a clash between the requests formulated in the We Demand Manifesto and those formulated or promulgated by the Village Initiative. On one hand, there's a case for the recognition of marginalized queer bodies that bases itself on rights. On the other, the safety of GLBT people, but mostly G really, is said to proceed from their ability to sell and consume. Hence, home is where my habits have a habitat. The juxtaposition of those pleas dehistoricizes queer struggles. It puts civil rights advocacy and mere corporatism on an equal atemporal footing. In the words of Michael Tosig, Ottawa's village is a theater of spirit possession. First, because of its performative nature, notions such as rainbow embellishment and beautification being reminiscent of a drag production. And second, because it's indicative of what engenders vibrancy and attachment in the larger local of the national imaginary and national fantasy for that matter. The village is a stage setting meant to facilitate the investment of living bodies with the strength or resilience inherited from queer struggles of the past, insofar, of course, as this affective transmission occurs within the confines of economic profitability. A collective enterprise, the We Demand mural displays the following message. We demand Canada's first demonstration for civil rights for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender persons, Ottawa, Saturday, August 28th, 1971. And then there's a French translation because Ottawa is, bilingual. And so I'm going to read it. So, we demand la première démonstration au Canada en faveur des droits civiques pour les gays, lesbiennes, bisexuels et transgenres, Ottawa, la samedi 28 août 1971. So what I did is I highlighted the mistakes on the French part. Yeah, so poor translation essentially, but also grammatical and spelling errors. And what I'm arguing essentially is that the aggregate of that's a slip, of lexical, orthographic, and grammatical mistakes invalidates the village's self-proclaimed bilingual identity. While the signs erected at a few corners of Bank Street claim the existence of the village, the artistic centerpiece meant to symbolize its aura fails to express a comparable concern for Francophone populations. With a linguistically inclusive header despite an English-only content, the Village Initiative's website ratifies a utopia that I see as a reversal of early Wittgensteinian logic. So essentially, it's a sentimental conviction that reality will come to embrace its politically saturated representation. This capitalist rationale, one of branding, conflicts evidently with the Village Initiative's rhetoric concerning the need to recognize an allegedly organic pattern of migration and densification. Now, it's in hopes that the signs enable economic growth in an area that had suffered from prolonged waves of instability that city and business representatives ultimately endorsed the Village Initiative's undertaking. It's also because of an analogous reasoning, the fear of losing non-GLBT customers, that the same actors had originally expressed reticence. So the business-oriented rationale has remained consistent, but has changed as the label chosen to market it. By upholding modes of safety and community bonding dependent upon the profits engendered by foreign customers, the Village Initiative's discourse reduces the living environment to a choice destination. In the context of Ottawa, it seems inevitable to compare the initiative with the National Capital Commission, or NCC, what we call a crown corporation that has proceeded over the past decade to the systematic destruction of living environments, neighborhoods, but also parks, natural habitats, in favor of a marketization of the region that relies first on the aestheticization of monarchical or imperial violence, and second on the commodification of Indigenous cultures. So the NCC has aligned its urban planning duties with a colonial agenda that shapes Ottawa as Canada's home. But considering its vocal opposition to the Occupy movement in the fall of 2011, it's a home in which dwelling is immaterial or actually ideological, especially in the case of Indigenous populations, which are secluded by NCC policies, not only geographically but temporally. Exoticized customs are enclosed within a distant historical before, where their potential for affective contagion is limited. The NCC's mantra is thus to keep Ottawa cute, in light of Siangai's assertion that the encounter with a cute object cutifies the subject. And she also says, as an aside, that one of the reactions prompted by a cute object is that you want to squeeze it so hard that you want to destroy it. And I see that happening. So absurd manifestations of institutional bilingualism are no stranger to the NCC either, taking into account its militaristic stance, blatant disregard for the politicized history of Canada's cultural and linguistic dissensions. The co-articulation of the Village Initiative and that of the NCC in relation to settler colonialism and indigeneity, which I'm unfortunately only brushing over, I think would deserve its own analysis, one that would, of course, hinge upon the work of my co-panelists. I fathom homonationalism in the case at hand as an affective fact, or an affectively self-fulfilling prophecy, which according to Masumi, is a sense of stability that appears in the face of fear, disruption, or threat. This concept suggests that affect, through the intensities and vibrations it disseminates, can outgrow the need for empirical modes of cognition, themselves partly in affective construction, in determining human matter's reactivity or reactions. While I don't endorse Masumi's complaint regarding the decline of empirical facts in logical discursive reasoning, which I believe undermines the role of affect in calibrating Cold War orientations, I insist that this author pertinently sheds light on the tautological logic whereby affective mechanisms can be legitimized. While Masumi's discussion of Bush-style preemption demonstrates how temporality of the always already serves to legitimize affectively elicited actions, I argue that affective facts transcend this particular political context, but only insofar as they are understood as manifestations of affect's capacity to self-effect. So my reasoning here is premised on the idea that an affect is an intensity that triggers attachment or detachment between different kinds and clusters of material and immaterial matter. All matter is affective, thereby affectivity is not only an important variable in the behavior or movement of entities, but a core dimension of what these entities are, their ontology. Attachment occasionally emerges as a response to a fear of detachment, and so on and so forth. So homonationalism as an affective assemblage proposes a certain configuration of attachments, which, due to its sterility, unavoidably implies a detachment from what it excludes from its structure, that is, aberrant, toxic, or unproductive bodies. The anxieties that circulate within and through Ottawa are mostly expressed as fear in the face of an increasingly unstable speculative economy, to which parenthetically an attachment is nevertheless maintained. These anxieties denote a fear of detachment from a national symbolic in which every individual who is, quote, willing to work, so able-bodied, ideally white and cis male, will be allowed to do so. So the temporality of the always already, to conclude, indexes homonationalist orientation, the vectors that connect queer identification with a neoliberal 21st century nation state as an apparatus. That constitutes an overpowering attachment to capitalist forms of circulation, both bodily and financial. So I'm really trying to map out some kind of hierarchized economy of attachment. This connection is a visceral response to the threat of detachment from the sentimental Fordist narratives, which have been revived at the federal level by the Conservative Party. In the homonationalist timescape, the present of a habitat, so the village, always already guarantees the enactment of its corresponding habits. So the/the village makes it bilingual, or the signs are a sufficient queering device that spatializes queerness, but also queer spatiality. The materiality of the street signs, so their metallic composition, which conveys Fordist hopes of durability, and their colorful facade, symptomatic of the codes of advertising in late capitalism, embodies a kind of socioeconomic affect that quite literally turns the body towards the nation state. And I should mention here that the village is in proximity to Canada's parliament, to which the signs directly point. So signs act as a stimulus for the affective fact. Ottawa's village is responsible for a form of catalysis or spectacularization. It accelerates the coagulation of queer and national modes of identification by positing as local and ergo seen and felt the threat of detachment from narratives of economic success and mobility.
Well, thank you so much to all of you fabulous folks. And we have plenty of time for questions and discussion, so who would like to begin?
Then I'll do it at once now.
It's like the second interactive part. The first one was awesome.
Well, one of the, I'll say that, and perhaps one of the things that felt to me connected a lot of these papers is the potential and complexities of alliances, and decolonial alliances specifically on Indigenous land and in solidarity with other Indigenous people in other places. So perhaps these kinds of complexities are a place we can start talking.
Okay, yeah, I'm curious if anyone wants to respond to it, but I guess I'm wondering how we can sort of speak about the sort of lack of, like for example in Canada and the US, sort of way in which queers have been unable or have failed to use the sort of pinkwashing or homonational argument to analyze what's happening inside the US. to Indigenous peoples, and also I think around homophobia in the war in Turner as well. How do we talk about that without sort of resorting to the sort of this Israeli exceptionalism argument? Because I feel like one sort of that seems to be like at least one possible direction for it to go in, unless you sort of just stay focused on the fact that the answer to why it's not happening is just sort of the erasure of settler colonialism. I don't know, because I guess a lot of the times when I've been thinking about it, the question that I ask myself, I guess, is just in a reactionary kind of way, the young Jew is like, oh, well, what about Israeli exceptionalism? But obviously that's not the answer. So I guess I was just curious if you guys could speak to that. Do you understand the question?
Can you
Yeah, how do we talk about the fact that Chris aren't talking about settler colonialism in Canada and the US without like allowing the argument about Israeli exceptionalism to enter the discourse? Or like, I mean, without like, without sort of
Resorting to it?
yeah, or giving like
Saying that the reason why this collision is happening is because of Israel as exceptional?
well, or saying that like people are attacking Israel unduly without critiquing because of anti-Semitism, essentially.
Yeah.
Because I see that as a very easy, like an argument that can be easily slipped in by like the whoever.
Well, this is a question I think which I put up ways to, right? And I don't really have answers, but I feel there is space for having both conversations together. What ends up happening is often I'm told, or I've heard this, which makes sense that in talks like these or an activist event, then those connections can be very superficial, right? That in 10 minutes you can't bring all these two different contexts together, or in an event you cannot really get into the complexities without saying, simplifying a lot of things. Right? But I feel there's still a lot of symbolic and political power in that, to do that. And the conversation, that's not the only way of imagining that, right? There's a lot more space to go beyond it to do it. So in terms of, I don't know if this is a practice here or in other places in the States, but in New York, in Toronto now, most events, no matter what they're about, they start with this acknowledgement, right? The way that I started. This acknowledgement is problematic at one hand, but it's also very symbolic at another, right? And I don't know where to draw the line. But I feel like if you don't acknowledge it, then it's falling back into the industrialization, right? That's what the Settler Colonial Project wants us to not think of that, right? It's just it's a pointer that people can take it anywhere that they want. But what within the context of talking about Israel and pinkwashing, it's an easy answer to say that contexts are very different and we can't talk about it. But I don't think that's the answer. I think there is a lot more room to do it, especially when we're having these conversations here, right? Like on indigenous lands in Israel and Pinkwashing, in Palestine, it's a different context. But here, non-native settlers, for me, I just don't understand how that doesn't happen. Right? How the transnational doesn't inform local and the local doesn't inform transnational. Why does the transnational have to come here first? Why does the local not go outside? Right? Like the binary that it creates and the imbalances that it creates, and in our analysis, in our scholarship, in our activist work, in our day-to-day. I don't know if I'm answering that question.
I think it's a really interesting question, Aziza, and I haven't, I may have encountered it and I'm forgetting it, but I think I want to acknowledge that kind of so much could occur, that there could be a way in which this discussion could slip in Israeli exceptionalism. But I don't recall seeing it yet come up when the attempt has been made to also address, and sometimes first, address sexualization and settler colonization on these lands when the conversation about Israeli pinkwashing is happening on these lands. So we would probably want to be mindful of that. But I think two directions that might already be in play that could be of assistance is, well, first, many of us have acknowledged that there is a robust, deeply historically rooted, and relatively recently re-energized and proliferated analysis of the sexualization of settler colonization on these lands. And it doesn't start by inspiration of a particular Israeli pinkwashing. It has its own genealogies. And what's interesting is that it has increasingly synergized, and I think that's that's to be expected because a lot of people who have been involved in these discussions have actually been involved in both. And increasingly, we are finding ourselves compelled to be involved in both. I don't know what the chicken or the egg is there, but it's happening. And it's really great, I think, or productive and generative, potentially. The other thing might be that, one thing that and it's just a curiosity because I feel ignorant and unable to ascertain why it may not have happened yet, or what might need to happen first before, the thing that I'm asking for emerging in an appropriate fashion. But it could be really interesting if there were more of a discourse coming out of the radical edges of Israeli Jewish LGBTQ activism, talking about the occupation in the context of a theory of settler colonialism, and being able to talk then about their positionalities, not in relationship to the occupied territories, but in relationship to the 1948 territories as something that invests them in the practice of settlement, and maybe even could lead to a recognition of an identity, or maybe I wouldn't be promoting an identity politics, but more of a sense of what that means for the social positioning of the Israeli queer settler in that context. I haven't really heard that. I have heard it sometimes, but it hasn't really been a focus of discussion, and I'm not necessarily asking for it, but like I said, right now. But I think it would be really productive if that discussion were to happen, maybe in a diasporic context between people, probably Jewish Americans and Canadians, but also non-Jewish, non-Jewish folks and non-natives in America, in the United States and Canada, thinking about our potential to think together comparatively about what it means to be positioned as a settler subject in the national context.
I think too, another way to kind of take on the question or re-ask the question from another angle is, what is it that's preventing people from actually lodging a critique here? Mm-hmm. And I think so much of that is about the question of foreclosure that links to what you mentioned in your paper, Scott, around people, like the question of seeing the potential for Palestine decolonization and beyond deoccupation, but not necessarily thinking about what something looks like in the 21st century in Canada and the US in terms of it's not the laws of occupation, it's a different kind of settler occupation, right, in terms of a legal mechanism and ways to sort of, at least normative law, to enforce what's illegal about it. And part of that is the treaty question, right, in terms of the treaties of cession that were coercive. And I know that not everybody's a treaty person or treaty people, right, people who live are on their unceded territory. And so I think that that's part of it, and I think it gets to the temporal question around people really not just looking at it as sort of a feasibility issue or a real politics issue in terms of overwhelming demographics, which I think is something that needs to be talked about, especially when we're talking about the theoretical modality of settler colonialism, which is all about demographics and land expropriation, because if we're taking Wolf's theory seriously, it's about the logic of elimination, which is about replacement. And so to me, though, that links to this question of people still relegating it to the past. Mm-hmm. I think that happens less in Canada because you've got more visibility and the demographic ratio is different. I don't mean that people are necessarily politically on board, but it's like people pretty much know whose territory they're on, right? For the most part. They know whose tribal territory they're on. I think unless people are living in New Mexico or Arizona or Washington State, very few people can name whose land we're on. That wasn't acknowledged here at this conference either, not by the opening nor the keynotes. And I think it's beyond the symbolic. It has to be like what you said, because we have to understand what happened here to understand how this stuff actually operates. So for me, that's a meaningful reckoning with how it functions, and what does it mean that Lenape tribes are scattered now into 7 different nations? What does it mean for people in Mannahatta to actually try and have a relationship with people who still claim this as their home territory even though they're not here? The other thing is I really want to push a bit on this colonial amnesia, because I think that inadvertently participates in that relegating it to the past. I don't think it's a forgetting, I think it's a denial. It's an outright disavowal, and I think colonial amnesia, we want to talk about people who won't remember, but I don't think that's necessarily about forgetting. And I think that that's part of how settler colonialism normalizes itself. And I really like the ending to, I can't remember which paper, around for it to be queer, it has to actually unsettle that. And that's because if we're really talking about it as something that's non-normative, then we have to unsettle self-colonialism.
I mean, positionality is like a huge thing at this conference, and it's been like brought up a lot, but I also think that we have to acknowledge that the regulation of life that occurs in the context that we're exploring is a regulation that does not only work at the unit of the human. And so, like, infested land kits were a thing 400 years ago, but now, like, using different substances in order to annihilate certain populations or debilitate them or alienate them is something that also occurs. So, and I think that this, like, history of employment of post-human devices of control also has to be taken into consideration. So when we talk about like unsettling settler colonialism, I also think that we have to talk about unsettling the category of the human and its positionality as the unit or the sort of like zero level from which we're supposed to navigate this landscape.
But to me, indigeneity already does that because it's about relationship to land. That's already inherent in the concept in terms of relationality. And I mean, that's the thing. We're right now in a place that is fully ethnically cleansed, and yet the people still exist as peoples, as distinct tribes now that come from one larger group. So I mean, I take what you're saying, but to me, that's already there. Like, it's indigenous people already know that. It's everyone else who has to catch up with them.
I think also it's important to then think of what the category of human means, and many indigenous scholars and scholars from colonized, racialized, oppressed contexts, indigenous scholars here or low caste academic scholars within South Asian subcontinent have said like how the category of human has been denied to them, right, through different systems of oppression, be it colonialism, caste, race, white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and whatnot. So when we have, and how it's always been so Eurocentric or now American Eurocentric, that idea of human that has to be challenged to go beyond that, right? And we have to think about intersectionality, not just intersectionality, but also the relationship with colonialism and capitalism to that too. That how I don't know how we can think of the human without really talking about these power relations first, right? And how, if there's no answer for these power relations, then I don't know how to go to that human, because most people have not been there for that,
That's also, I think, people still think when they hear indigenous people talk about land as mother, they think it's metaphorical, not understanding it's an actual kinship relation. It's relational through kinship, and that's where the obligation comes in. I mean, also, like, I don't know, can anybody think of anybody for an indigenous name that doesn't mean the people? Maybe there's a couple exceptions, but that's all about differentiation from other living entities. So I mean, you know, most everybody's name for themselves means the people or the true people, and that's, you know, as I understand it, the way people narrate it, and certainly in the Kanaka Maoli context, it's about differentiation from other living entities to actually have a relationship with them, but it isn't human in the Western sense. And part of that denial is about not just Christianity, but in terms of
I have a question, touching upon this question of comparative analysis and conceptual, the issue of the framework of apartheid, whether the category of apartheid, what kind of role that may or may not have, and the usefulness of that within the framework of connecting settler colonialism in North America and connecting it to settler colonialism in Israel.
I wonder if anyone on our panel knows the history behind the popular story, which may be apocryphal or may be quite concrete, that that representatives from South Africa traveled to Canada in order to be educated in the research system as part of the inspiration system. I'm forgetting, I don't know if anyone in that knows that, certainly not. But there's certainly an understanding that there was either a formal or an informal relationship there, and the past laws that were established in the research system at a very early which were completely militarized. And this is to surprise us. I mean, reservations are military, the results of military occupation that are contained in the imperial Quebec. And the pass law system emerges in Canada, as I understand it, through the assignment of a colonial. It's a process of colonial governmentalization. Subject is created as Indian in their context because it's assigned, a person gets assigned a status that only makes sense in terms of when it's being contained and when it's allowed out. And so the pass law, assigning pass card that had to be signed when you leave the reserve and return, and the way that was thought of in the expansion of settler capitalism, and the way that Indigenous people were asked to play certain kind of economical off reserve as the only sort of legitimate reason to be able to move across the traditional territories. This kind of stuff was all there, and it's screaming at just so there's a lot of connection.
Thanks, everyone. Those are really wonderful presentations. I'd like to address it to Nishant, but anyone I'd be curious to hear your opinion on this. Just because you addressed this in your paper, this dynamic. So I work here in the U.S. in a group that's a mostly non-native group that's in solidarity with a group of Dene folks who are resisting forced relocation up in northeastern Arizona. And one thing that we've observed over the years of doing this work is that there's a pretty well established in the U.S. seeming kind of white Indigenous binary with Indigenous support and solidarity work. It seems like white settler-identified folks take a lot of sort of ownership of that space or of that role, filling that role and doing a lot of foreclosing and policing of kind of who is what that work means and just defining it and who gets to come in and do that and in what ways. And I was curious, I have certain theories on kind of why that happens here, but I was curious if that's a similar dynamic in Canada and if so, what your thoughts on that?
They are, and I think that's how white supremacy works, and that's not just in the context of this specific question of Indigenous solidarity, but any. If we are from the history of unions and communists left in here, or to now more different models of organizing in progressive politics, right? So in Toronto too, I think the dynamics have been very similar in terms of, and there are different spaces. In some cases, are a lot more progressive and inclusive than others, right? But there are definitely some groups where I know a number of my colleagues and friends have been racialized peoples have left those settings and groups because they could not work in that setting, right? And how race works, and race along with gender, and then with class and with sexuality, and how they want that in ways that people have left those spaces, racialized people have left those spaces, right? Because of the binary that gets created again, that it's white and Indigenous, right? And I guess in States it gets more complicated with talking about black communities here, but in Canada that binary is always, it's just Indigenous or it's white, right? And everyone else is just diasporic, no matter how long your history goes back to that country, right? Be it South Asians or Chinese or Japanese communities which have been there for a long time, they're always rendered diasporic, right? So in that context, that invisibilization happens, race there. But your question, I think that's not just true of that one space, but every other space whiteness works like that, right? It's not about individuals and certain ways, but how the power relations are never really. I feel like we don't really have a language to talk about the power relations. We can keep talking about it, the language I'm using, but to actually start doing some work, it's not easy to ask, right? Question our positionalities and privileges on different ways. That I embody, I have to show that I overlook them many times. So, but within Indigenous solidarity, that's a question that's been raised many times within settings that I'm aware of.
It's not plenty of time.
Curious to go back to the part of your paper that was just at the beginning about the kind of the allyship between by Toronto and like, this free speech formula, and it's something that's been coming up a lot here around arguments around free speech have been used on the side of like pro-BDS people when the Brooklyn College thing happened and stuff, and like academic freedom in ways that I've been concerned about, because I feel like we've been doing a good job in this set of conversations this conference is about critiquing like these homonationalist ideas of the state as our protector when it comes to hate crimes laws and prisons and wars and marriage and stuff, but then when it comes to that freedom of speech, it turns out some people like believe in this, which is so intense, like how could that exist in capitalism? And so I am curious, but also and I understand it not, so I don't know how these discourses happen in Canada, it's different because of different systems, but also I don't quite know. I also have heard that the battle around Toronto Pride has made the term Israeli apartheid something that like people, everybody's heard, which is just, that's kind of cool. Like, that's like kind of an amazing outcome that maybe makes it tactical or strategic to have this to be a debate about free speech and it must, you know. I'm just kind of curious, I don't know if any of you, but especially maybe from my paper, thought about that particular set of claims and how they're traveling in this work, especially since I think free speech claims are actually the opposite of boycott claims in some ways, so boycotts about content.
I think that's been really amazing that how the choir has been able to talk about Israel in a much more has gotten that space to talk about these issues, right? Extra, which is gay lesbian monthly, has written so much about it, or it's become a face of queer organizing, right? And every pride, because of what happens and how choir engages very strategically these debates, I think it's been very remarkable and not to romanticize radicalness again, but it is pretty radical in the context of Toronto, what I'm more familiar with in other places. And Israeli apartheid is there. People it cannot be taken away from that popular imagination. And backlash that choir gets from pro-Israeli lobbyists and Zionist lobbies and whatnot, it's all there and it's really amazing, right? Like, but I think we were trying to talk about through the paper is then how then through by coalition that term then again just got the context of that term got lost, right? It just became a term, but it was not about Palestinian peoples within the BCFS. Coalition for Free Speech, that it's about censorship. And in one of the points that I read, it said, beyond Israel, beyond Palestine, right? So then what strategically it creates amazing, but then also then what is the context of that and what's happening behind that. So, and every time I read that line, I said, beyond Israel, beyond Palestine, like how that line gets, I just don't know how to actually engage with it.
And the line you read too, it was something that was like this romantic, like Canada protects free speech. What's going on?
Yeah.
It's an aberration. Yeah. It's just, I mean, it's so horrifying.
Yeah.
So I have a question about the way that, so settler colonialism, I'm pretty sure I understand the ways that Native peoples are made dispensable and disposable, but I'm curious what you think about the ways that they become like indispensable to settler colonialism. So thinking about the U.S. context, the IRA stuff in the 30s as a redemption, reconciliation for like the problem of allotment, and then like in the 70s, the self-determination stuff as a solution for the problem of immigration policy, and sort of the ways that that works. So thinking about how homonationalism, it's not just the state's monopoly on violence, but the way that that also is tied into the state's monopoly on care, and the ways that like the sort of indispensability of the state has to be here to take care of and protect people who have been subject to genocide practices. So I'm thinking about so there is disposability, but also what about this the indispensability of the way that there is this, I think that Bowen talks about.
Your question, I think, is could go in many directions, and the place that I'm leading to immediately is exactly the framework you presented, but maybe it's productive connection. When I think about how Kevin Brunel or also Mark Griffin have written a little bit about how settler sovereignty is exposed as dependent upon the very assignation of sovereignty into indigenous nations as part of its own imagination and creation. So when Brunel makes the argument that there's a post-colonial relationship in a theoretical sense, not in a temporal sense, between U.S. American settler sovereignty and the assertions of sovereignty by Native American nations, which have been accorded that status under U.S. law. I think he's suggesting that this doesn't just acknowledge that that indigenous claims to sovereignty are oppressing the borders of settler sovereignty, but also that settler sovereignty is to some degree dependent upon that tension in relationship and contestation to know what it is. That was something that I took out of his work that has been ruminating on and thinking about what his possible implications are, because when I go to the Canadian context, which is for me a new context to be in and to think about, I'm struck by how Idle No More seems to send shivers down the spines of conservative defenders of Canadian sovereignty. I mean, you've got a really historically recent constitution, one that hasn't even been ratified by what I would say like Anglophone defenders of settler sovereignty are much more terrified about Quebec separatism than they are about the possibility that they're going to lose control of land to indigenous nations. And so the fact that Quebec hasn't ratified the Constitution is always present in the discussion. And then the Constitution also acknowledges to a certain degree, but it's all completely ambiguous, right? It's typical of liberal multiculturalism, that indigenous land rights or land claims could extend beyond the lands that have been assigned to indigenous peoples through the reserve system. But nobody knows what that means. So I don't know more is raising all of these tensions up to the surface. And I think that might be, just to get back to your observation, Kalani, that I think it's that the defenders of Canadian settler sovereignty know that in order to justify their existence and their state's existence under the current standards of international law that have been reimagined through the United Nations over the last century, and relationship to minority rights, official multiculturalism, indigenous rights, they're aware that they don't necessarily yet have, under their own terms, a strong enough claim to defend their integrity into the future. But I think just on the problem of care, I mean, if you were reading the Canadian news media, people would be perfectly happy to get rid of Arawakaskat. Like the dependency relationship is not something that I think most white Canadian defenders of settler colonialism are attached to. And so, but I don't want to suggest that doesn't, because the system actually has not been taken apart. So I think we might want to look at how those deliveries of care have also been methodologies of forced assimilation historically, and that it's been a way through which, like the imposition of heteropatriarchal governance structures within the reserve system, which preferentially elevated indigenous male leaders and exiled indigenous women and their descendants from the band and from the land historically. Like there's been a methodology for a progressive process of assimilation and forced dependency. So the health stuff is there, but
If I could jump into exactly what you're talking about, this whole narrative of look at how great we're treating the Indians. You see that all through art history. And one of the things, I have quite a few criticisms of Muckman's work, but one of the major ones is that he only reverses this and it makes it really sexy. Like all of his characters they're really there isn't very much violence in it. They're all like really buff and hot and wearing minimal clothing and heels. And additionally, his works are not only seen pretty politically, but they sell, like Elton John as a pen. His works sell for like $1,500,000 these days. And so you would think that contemporarily, a lot of these narratives that we've seen of this really beautiful interaction, this beautiful encounter, that it would be kind of demolished at this point, but at least in our history from what I've seen, it's not. Especially in someone like Ken Muckman, who is pretty mainstream. There are, of course, artists who are working against this, but in his work, and if you get to the level where he is, and if you want to get to that level, you have to really still play into that narrative, and that idea of care and like this beautiful interaction going on, which is really problematic.
I think that the anxieties in relation to Ireland are also connected to the post-2008 economic crisis, and that like plays with the notion of care a lot. So I remember there was a train that was halted from I want to say from and so for a few hours, and people just like waited 2 hours in the train, no big deal. And people were commenting on the VRL Facebook page, and somebody said. And somebody said, we all have bad days, but like sometimes you just have to like suck it up and not like go outside and protest. But this idea that we all have bad days, I think it's like I think it's very symptomatic of this erasure of colonialism or of the history of colonialism, and because all that's being shown, all that's like hyper visible in the current media landscape is the relationship of care that is a white fantasy, essentially, that like these people are dependent on state funding. And yeah, so that like has to do, I think, with people's anxieties with relation to care and how like there's a sort of like revival in the faith of this economic system now that it's proven multiple times that it's another failure.
Maybe I'll just jump in for 1 sec, not to answer your question, but just to continue the debate. And I guess the thread in my paper is to say we can't remove settler colonialism from other systems. And so when we talk about settler colonialism, we can't just talk about it in a vacuum. It's connected to white supremacy. It's connected to hetero patriarchy. And I'm just calling, I'm engaging with kind of South Asian scholars in Toronto in particular, who are saying. The kind of movement towards settler colonial theory is potentially becoming a new whiteness studies. So I think as people who are as excited as us think about these really difficult discussions, we also have to kind of listen to the anti-racist scholars, the diasporic scholars, and kind of say, if we're going to engage in these difficult conversations around settler colonialism, we have to think about it as it's connected to white supremacy. We can't not even nonsense, but
mentioned something related to that, but going back to what Sam mentioned around indispensability, I think that's the other piece is, and linking to post-2008, is that the removal's still happening, right? So I'm thinking about at Keystone XL pipeline, and part of it is it's indispensable because of the resource question, and you can see it all over the Americas, it's just forced back armed removal of indigenous peoples to get minerals, to get energy resources, to get into oil. And I think until we can actually start talking about that as present day settler colonialism, again, just refusing to let people relegate it to the past if we're going to take it seriously as a structure. And I think what you're raising, and I think this panel's been really excellent. I hope I didn't come off as hostile in terms of the amnesia stuff. I just really want us to kind of talk about it. But the other piece around the systems, I would love to see more conversation across the Canada-US piece, because one of the things that I think has stopped conversation is that there's a different binary, and that's the black-white binary that finds the indigeneity question is a hostile one, because people take it as though people don't want to deal with the legacy of slavery, rather than looking at the system of enslavement in relation to the system of settler colonialism. And that you can't do one or the other in the USA, because both were happening at the same time for hundreds of years prior to the formation of the USA. And so the question around, the difference that slavery makes. But this has just been a halting point. There was the Big Tent event at UCLA in March 2011, Race and Sovereignty. And even the name of it to me showed the off parallel. Instead of being civil rights and sovereignty and sort of race and indigeneity, it was race and sovereignty, right? So it was like a kind of a different mismatch. And one of the big things in the room, and I mean, Nandita Sharma was there, and she kept just insisting that colonialism, she kept hitching it only onto whiteness and didn't want to deal with the settler or colonial kind of question. But she's in Hawaii now, where there's like a full-fledged nationalist movement, and it's fixed to independent statehood, unlike the Canadian First Nations community and Aboriginal struggles, which are not necessarily forming an independent state, right? But it's legacy of the Hawaiian Kingdom, so her hostility's like been ramped up. She's ramped it up quite a bit, and I felt like at that event, there was just this. It never got hashed out. There were panels that even talked about it, but just could not get past this question of, well, but slavery, and the question of Black descendants of slavery. And it's like, well, why can't we talk about both of those together? We know how they operated together historically and legally, but what happens is the Indigenous piece drops out, and then you've got the racial tyranny of the binary, the racial binary, that still doesn't deal with the question of whose land we're on. And so I think doing more of this cross-settler colonial comparison, as well as obviously the Indigenous piece, is really important. And also getting at the question of settlers of color, or issues of complicity related to different legacies of how people got to where they are. And I'm not saying there's no differentiation to be made. This is where I part ways with some of the scholars working on Asian settler colonialism in Hawaii is, I do want to make a distinction between war refugees that come from the Vietnam War, and also the fact that King Kalakaua recruited Japanese people to settle in Hawaii, and that happened on Hawaiian sovereignty watch. I mean, to me, that's different than tracing a post-World War II Japanese-American political ascendancy in Hawaii that's been disastrous for Hawaiians. Everyone said Daniel Inouye's last word was aloha. I'm sure it was drone. Or maybe it was 2 words, fuck Hawaiian.
And we only have just a few minutes, but I do also want to say that I really appreciate these kinds of conversations among decolonial movements, but also Indigenous communities between the US and Canada, because I think that I assume sometimes because of my location in the US that I'm naive about First Nations issues because we don't hear about them, but I actually find often that when I'm with Indigenous folks in Canada that we don't have the same conception because we have different legal systems going on, defining and non-defining and erasing and all of these kinds of things. Different relation or non-relation to the crown, exactly. So, but a lot of our nations, including Lenape folks, are divided by the US-Canadian border, right? Our lands. So we need to and some people have really clear understandings of that border to travel across in treaty or whatever. But I think if we're thinking about decolonization and decolonial tactics among Indigenous queer and Two-Spirit people, that we also have to acknowledge that we're trying to build alliances with each other as well. And that needs to acknowledge that we have, not just based on the nation state that's colonizing us, but we have different issues. It's not necessarily, we may all be trying to, overturn settler colonialism, but, I'm thinking about legacies of removal, right? Like Cherokee and Lenape folks are on Osage land, right? So some of the Lenape folks, Delaware Nation, northeastern Oklahoma. So we also have these really complex relationships with one another that settler colonialism either sometimes put into motion or use to their advantage, right? And I think the same issues come up when we're talking about decolonial alliances among Indigenous people and other racialized folks, right? So that not only do I think that we really need to critique the way settlement works, but that, again, like Cherokee folks and Chickasaws and Seminoles, lots of people, I'm not just calling out as Southeastern folks, but not only do we often share kinship with each other across African and Indigenous networks, folks engage in chattel slavery, right? So there are ways that we need to be having conversation about alliance and certainly like, culpability in settler colonialism and in white supremacy among all of these differences for us to really get rid of colonial powers, That's my soapbox. What got it? Thank you.